I'm Angie Thurman, and I'm a developmental psychologist, and we are at the University of California, Davis. And our research team is very interested in a lot of things, but really at the main focus of our program is on language and communication development. And we'll talk a little bit more today about why that always is kind of a standout for us. And so, as is the case with research, our projects kind of change as the world and needs of people change, but we tend to have projects that range from starting with children often as young as 18 months into um, early adulthood, and we're moving into middle adulthood and later adulthood now. So we really try to keep our program focused on um, across developmental phases. And then, Len, do you want to?
Sure. Hi. Andrew's pretty much said what we need to say. I'm Leonard Abbeduto. I am also a developmental psychologist, and I used to be the director of the Mind Institute here at UC Davis, and then retired just to focus on research, which I love to do and get to continue to meet families and try and support families. So thanks very much for being here on a Saturday morning. We're looking forward to talking to you a bit and then hopefully answering some questions if you have them too.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and start. Um, Sorry, hang on 1 second. Oh, all right. I think I did it. Can you see um my screen, and it looks like the correct way to view a screen with just one slide? Okay. So today, we're going to walk a little bit through language and communication in individuals with Down syndrome. And we wanted to share our disclosures. And really, nearly all of our research is funded by the National Institutes of Health. Um, and we have received money from LuMind, which is one of the foundations supporting research and um, progress supporting families of individuals with Down syndrome. And then we have received some funding that has come from pharmaceutical companies, but those have mainly been for research looking at clinical trials. So when they do testing of whether a medication or treatment works. So nothing is coming to us specifically. It's all just going to the research projects we are supporting. Um, so I'm going to start on the area of communication development. So I'm going to start on the earlier end of development. And I wanted to start with why we really always come back to communication as a central key focus for our team. So communication is really central to connecting with others, learning from others, and supporting independence. And so, because communication plays a critical role in supporting long term learning and independence, it's why it's really important to understand and support communication development across the lifespan. When we look at communication, it's important to recognize that the skills that mark communication development change and grow over time. And so, even before individuals use words, we see lots of changes in communication development that set the foundation for everything that's left to come. So, before words start, we talk about pre linguistic communication. And this really refers to things like eye contact or sharing attention, vocalizing, or the types of sounds you might hear before individuals start to form words like cooing and babbling, gesture, so pointing and waving, clapping, and the facial expressions we use. So it's really important to recognize that communication is really broad and comes in lots of different forms and really starts from birth and is always something we're trying to support and monitor how changes occur. Then at some point, we usually start to shift our attention to linguistic communication. So that really focuses on words. So the first things we tend to see are first words or single word productions, where we see words for naming people, things, and actions. From there, we start to see individuals combine words together or put endings on words, and that's how we tend to monitor growth. And we see that increasing our vocabulary and our word combinations start to kind of happen simultaneously and support each other. It's really important to recognize that there are different ways to express language. Not all children or individuals learn to speak at the same time or in the same way. And so, for many children, we are going to look at the ways they use other ways to communicate while speech develops instead of speech developing, or these things are happening at the same time. And so, what is common is the use of manual signs or sign language. This is one way that when spoken communication is developing a little more slowly, we can kind of support communication alongside or instead of speech, depending on what we're doing. We also see augmentative and alternative communication use. So this is often referred to as AAC, and can come in a lot of different ways. So we see individuals using pictures, symbols, high-tech devices that can generate speech from pictures or from typing. And so these are all great options. And it's also important to recognize that using sign language or an AAC can really support and encourage spoken language. And some of the ways this happens is by building communication confidence. So when individuals can express their needs and ideas, they're motivated to interact and engage in communication. And this is a crucial part of long-term development, right? Using these alternative paths to communication also helps build vocabulary and language structure, which is a really crucial component of language development. So that helps individuals understand how language works and that words represent ideas. It supports a positive learning environment. So when children can communicate successfully, or individuals, right? We're really talking about all people, they feel less frustrated and encourages interactions. So, communication tools of any form really help individuals take turns, share information, respond, and all of this is really crucial for communication development. And as I mentioned, it can be used alongside speech. It's common for us to hear worries that if we take or support these alternative paths, that it might prevent spoken language from occurring, but there's no evidence of that, right? We have lots of different paths that individuals take in their communication development. And in many, many cases, these are great strategies for helping support communication while those spoken language words are taking their time to develop. I wanted to add here also that learning with an alternative communication system or using sign language is just like learning words. And it's quite an investment, and it takes a lot of time for individuals to acquire. So when we think about spoken word learning, if we are looking at development in a child who's picking this up relatively smoothly, we can see a year, 2 years before it really clicks what everything is doing and how what those words are and how they have meaning. And that same process is really a part of learning communication in any form. So, depending on where an individual is, it can take different amounts of time for these tools to really take root. And so, a lot of times if we had a choice, we would love to see this stuff implemented right alongside spoken language development and give them all time to take root because it's learning like a new language, right? Whatever form we do. So it's not really like a fast fix, but if spoken language is really challenging to acquire, it's a really great option um, along the way. So I wanted to turn to what makes communication unique for individuals with Down syndrome. So what do we see from research on language development in this group? So we know that talking often takes longer to develop. Many individuals begin speaking later than their peers, but we do see continued growth and progress just at their own paces. So that's what we really focus on. We also often see a mix of areas of strength and areas where support might be a little bit more needed. So individuals may also use their strengths to help with the parts of communication that are a little bit more challenging. And so that kind of makes each person's individual road toward communication growth a little bit different. So some things we might see as strengths, oftentimes if we talk about a group, we would describe and the information and research describes that individuals with Down syndrome generally really enjoy social interaction and communication. We tend to see a lot of strength in body language, facial expressions, gestures, as a method of supporting communication and expressing what they want and feel and desire. Um, and when we focus on spoken language or word use, we tend to see that vocabulary is a relative strength compared to other aspects of spoken language development. When we shift to areas that we might need a little bit extra support, that putting words together or making more complicated sentences, putting endings on words, that can be a little bit more slow relative to vocabulary development. We know that saying things clearly can be a challenge for individuals with Down syndrome. And that also is very much related to like the coordination of the movements needed for speech. So a little bit of that motor planning for speech production can be a little more tricky. It's important to also talk about what impacts language development. And again, this is why everybody's story is a little bit different. So when we talk about individuals with Down syndrome, we know that hearing can affect how children hear and learn sounds, whether that is impacted hearing from repeated ear infections or things like that, or hearing loss at various levels. Not being able to hear the sounds around you clearly can change your language development trajectory. Medical needs. So, health conditions or frequent illnesses can impact your physical ability, your energy, your focus, your time or strength that you're able to dedicate to communication development. The truth is, at many points in time, the priorities we need to take in development can kind of slow down other aspects of development that are not the priority right now, and that can change the road we take. Muscle tone. So, low muscle tone can affect how clearly a child or individual can move the muscles they need to speak. And can also influence their ability to interact with and learn from their environment. So, you might see a lot of attention to the relationship between motor development and language development. We know that as children get more strength and ability to interact with their environment, it kind of changes what they're able to learn from and take away from their environment. And that's really supportive for communication development. Motivation and social engagement. So children and individuals interested and able to interact with others often have more opportunities to practice communication, and that practice is often related to growth, right? So and that's also a little bit of all these other things, hearing, medical needs. These things can impact our ability to be motivated and engaged in these interactions. And thinking and learning skills, we do know that memory, attention, how quickly individuals can process information all play roles in development. And so, depending on our individual differences in these areas, we have kind of a different trajectory or a different set of steps ahead of us on our path to communication development. When we talk about early communication development, we have one really big study that tells us that first words, which really the study did, at what age did a child have one single word when they had Down syndrome? The study found that 12% of kids had their first word by 23 months of age, and 80% of kids with Down syndrome had their first word by 35 months of age. And this is compared to what we might describe as being a milestone that often emerges between 10 to 15 months in the general population. When we then look at what age children hit a 50-word vocabulary size, these researchers reported that 50% of kids with Down syndrome had a 50-word vocabulary size by 4 years, and that 75% of kids had a 50-word vocabulary size by 5 years. And again, this is compared to what we might often associate with an 18 to 24-month developmental period. Two-word combinations, we really tend to push this out to 3.5 years or later for most individuals with Down syndrome. And what's really important about this study is, even though it gives us a glimpse of some sense of timing of things, it was done what we call cross-sectionally. So that means they just took a bunch of individuals at different ages and said, okay, what percent of people had this by this age? It wasn't like a systematic follow each individual over and over again to see how their trajectories work. And these were really the only milestone pieces we're able to take away from this study. And so what we know is we need a lot more. We still don't know enough about how communication skills change and grow. And specifically, we think some of the big things that are really important for us to answer are when we might expect children with Down syndrome to reach certain communication milestones, the different paths they may take. A lot of our research focuses on group data, which is a really important thing, is to figure out patterns. When we have a group, we can kind of tell what direction things are going. But the other thing we have to do is recognize how different everyone is, and kind of balance that group data with how much variability there is across people. So it's really important we follow those different paths to help us unpack who might be doing what when. And we want to be able to figure out how early we can tell if individual children with Down syndrome might need extra support compared to other children with Down syndrome, right? Right now, so many providers and parents are making their decisions based on what we know about typical development, which just leaves us to know know that things are going to work slower. But that doesn't really help us answer the questions we get from families. And so we have families often asking questions that providers don't really have the information from literature. We have families often telling us that they're trying to find a friend or another family whose child might be a little bit like theirs so they can kind of figure this stuff out for themselves. And what we really need from research is to learn more about the different ways children with Down syndrome develop support and support to help children. There's some typos and some different things in that sentence. We need to learn more about the different ways children with Down syndrome develop and support and help each child learn in a way that works for them. And so we are doing a new project focused on this that if anyone's interested, we'd be happy to talk about. But that's kind of my piece on the early development. So I'll swap out with Len.
Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit now about, well, two things. First, we're going to talk a little bit about language development in older teenagers and young adults, because it's kind of an interesting pattern. And then we're going to talk a little bit about interventions. And in particular, we've done some research on developing parent implemented interventions. These are interventions in which we essentially teach parents how to support their children's language development. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that. That research has not been with individuals with Down syndrome, but the same principles would work just fine with those with Down syndrome as well. So again, just a little bit about kind of what happens beyond early childhood and into adolescence. So one of the things that we used to think a long time ago when I first got into this field is there was kind of this wisdom, which was not based on very much research, that around the age of 12, which is when puberty starts, that there's a switch in the brain that kind of turns off your capacity to learn language. I'm sure you've all, if you've had experience where young children get exposed to a new language, they seem to pick it up very easily compared to adults. And so the thought was is that there's some kind of critical period, and around age 12, you just kind of you're not quite as skilled at learning language. And for people with Down syndrome, that's really consequential, it was thought, because as Angie said, they're learning more slowly. So if they're learning more slowly and then things stop at age 12, that's really problematic. And so they used to talk about this plateau that people with Down syndrome would reach around age 12, where they really wouldn't learn much more language. Well, we know that that turns out that that's not true. That there's good evidence that people with Down syndrome continue to learn many aspects of language well beyond childhood, well beyond the age of 12. And so that's really good news. Um, on the other hand, as I'm sure you know, people with Down syndrome are also at really elevated risk for early onset Alzheimer's disease. And oftentimes we'll have some of the kind of the brain changes that are the basis of Alzheimer's disease very early, sometimes in their late 30s and early 40s, although we may not see symptoms until much later. So one of the things that we've wanted to do is to try and understand if we look really closely and really in a detailed way at language and communication, kind of in adolescence, early adulthood, can we find some early signs of decline, early signs that may tell us who's most at risk to begin to lose skills and to be at risk for Alzheimer's disease and all of the consequences of Alzheimer's disease. And the idea being that if we can identify kind of the earliest point in which people begin to show kind of decline or a loss of skills, if we get to the point where we have interventions and treatments, whether those are medical interventions or lifestyle interventions or behavioral interventions, then we can start those earlier and really have an impact on those who need it first. And so we've been really looking at trying to understand kind of areas where we see not growth necessarily, but decline that may kind of foreshadow some of the early declines that we see in Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. And so in this figure right here, this is from a study we did a few years ago. And each line represents a single person who was participating in the study. And in this study, these were young people with Down syndrome who were between the ages of 10 and 25 at the start of the study. And we measured them twice. So this is a longitudinal study. We had two time points or two assessments spaced by 2 years. So each line represents kind of the change that an individual person made over a 2 year period. Some started when they were 10 when we were seeing them, and then they ended at age 12. Others were in their 20s when we started, and then followed them for 2 years. And this is a measure of receptive vocabulary. This is called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which is a very commonly used test in research and in clinical research by speech language clinicians. And what we found when we looked at these 10 to 20-year-olds with Down syndrome, and you can see it, all of the lines for the most part, not all, but most of the lines look like they're going up, so that there's a positive change, that there's more growth in receptive vocabulary. And we found that that was true whether we were looking at the youngest kids in the sample or the oldest individuals in the sample. And so we're continuing to see into the 20s growth in receptive vocabulary. So understanding words continues to improve at least until the early to mid 20s based on this research. But we also saw kind of complicated pictures for other aspects of language. And I think one of the things, and Angie talked a little bit about this, is that although language is delayed pretty much in everyone with Down syndrome, and pretty much all aspects of language is delayed relative to neurotypical age peers, there's kind of an uneven profile. So some areas are more affected than others. And we continue to see that when we look to see whether we have loss of language skills. And so these are two slides of different measures from the same study. And again, so these are, each line is an individual person and their amount of change in 2 years. And on the left panel, this is expressive vocabulary. So this was essentially measuring kind of the breadth of vocabulary people with Down syndrome used when they were telling a story in a wordless picture book. And so they basically had to invent a story based on these pictures. And then we measured kind of the number of different words they use, so kind of the breadth of vocabulary. And what we found there was kind of a complicated pattern in that we saw for the younger kids, and you can see it when you look at the there's individual lines, there's a lot of lines that are going up. So there's a lot of improvement in the early years, and probably up until about age 15, 16 or so. We're still seeing a lot of improvement in vocabulary. But when we look at kind of the other part of that panel, an expressive vocabulary, we're looking to the people that are in their late teens and 20s. What you can see is that there's not so much change. And in fact, some of the lines are flat, so there's no change. And a few, there are declines. There's a decrease in vocabulary, kind of a loss of expressive vocabulary skills. And so for expressive vocabulary, we see this complicated pattern where there continues to be growth. But then in the late teens, early 20s, we're starting to see things level off, or maybe for some people even decline. And an important question that we haven't addressed yet or been able to answer yet are these declines foreshadowing later Alzheimer's disease? And if so, then maybe this gives us a point of intervention when we have more effective treatments. Now, if you look at the other side, non-word repetition, and this is a measure where people listen to kind of made up words, kind of nonsense words, bapo, ziza, and things like that. And so these are words that they've never heard before, presumably. And so and then we test their memory for those words. And the basic idea is this is kind of the first stage of learning language, right? You need to remember these sounds that you hear that when they're new, and then try and figure out what the meaning of those words is. So this is really kind of a measure of the potential to remember sounds that is going to be the basis of your word learning. And what we found there, and you can see this when you look at the individual signs, there's variability, there are differences between people. But what we found was that there really was a decline, so that their ability to do this test got worse over time. And that was just as true for the younger folks, the people closer to 10, 12, and so, as it was for the people in their 20s. And so this suggests that this really important capacity to remember sounds as kind of the foundation for learning words is really starting to decline even in late adolescence. And I think that that's important. Again, that may indicate that this is a foreshadowing Alzheimer's disease, but even if it does it means that there's a skill that we really want to try and figure out how to intervene so people can continue to learn words and learn more about language. So I want to kind of shift now and talk about some parent implemented language interventions. And I like to talk about this, even though this is not, these research studies were not about Down syndrome, but because I think the principles are really important. And I think these are principles that parents can follow to support language in children and individuals with a variety of neurodevelopmental conditions. And the nice thing about this is we uh, deliver this through telehealth. And so parents need not come into a clinic or a research center to participate. And these studies that I'm going to talk to you about, we focused on helping parents learn these strategies and supporting language growth in individuals with Fragile X syndrome. And Fragile X syndrome is the leading inherited cause of intellectual disability. And it's one of the leading causes of single gene causes of autism. About more than half of people that have um, Fragile X syndrome have not only an intellectual disability, but they also meet criteria for autism. And so we've tried to support their language development. But again, I think many of these principles will work just as well in individuals with Down syndrome. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. And so the basic way is, and this is not particularly surprising, the way in which we parents or caregivers interact with and talk to children shapes their language development. Children need to have a lot of exposure to language, and they get most of that through their family and through adult caretakers, people who know the language and can present the language to them and show them how to use it to communicate, if you will. And so what we try and do is we try and teach parents how to optimize their interactions and language input with their sons and daughters who have neurodevelopmental conditions. And this is not in any way to blame parents for the language problems that their kids display. It's just the fact that for many of these individuals, it's kind of harder to support their language because maybe they learn a little slower, or they may not want to interact or play as much, or they may avoid social interactions and things like that. And so we kind of help parents orient to do things they probably would do if there weren't these other barriers to supporting their children's language. And so, as I mentioned, we deliver the intervention to the parent in the home through video teleconferencing and other technologies. And basically, what we do is we do some didactics, some PowerPoints, and with video examples to show parents how to use these strategies to support their sons and daughters' language development first. And then we also coach them in real time as they're interacting with their kids. And so the parent will have a Bluetooth so we can kind of talk to them without the child hearing, and we give them kind of instructions in that. And then they can also do homework sessions and we can give them feedback. And the basic idea is parents have a lot of power to really support their children's language because they know their children as well. They spend more time with their children than any speech language clinician ever could. And so, in theory, this is a way of getting parents involved and empowered, but also allowing them the opportunity to give their kids kind of a really intense and consistent dose of an intervention, if you will, because they're with their kids so much. And so here are just some of the advantages of what we're calling PILI, or parent implemented language intervention, and doing it kind of through telehealth. So low burden on families. They don't have to travel. They can stay home to learn and use these strategies. We think it supports generalization. What I mean by that is we really want kids to get better at using language in their daily lives, in the real world. And so if we teach families how to support language at home, that's the real world. That's different than doing it in a clinic. We think it's accessible to most families. Most families have access to the internet, whether it's through computers or through their cell phones. As I mentioned, it enables a high dose and duration of treatment because parents can spend more time with their kids than can any speech language clinician or therapist. It's cost effective because we don't really have to travel. And it really, I think the other thing that's nice about it is that oftentimes parents feel like they're shut out of the intervention process. And I think this really creates a nice partnership or alliance between the professionals who are teaching the parents these strategies and the parents who are really implementing them in their daily lives as they interact with their kids with neurodevelopmental conditions. So the intervention structure is, as I mentioned, parent education through these didactics, real-time coaching, and then homework where families will show us videos of them using these strategies, and then we provide feedback. And most of the studies that we've done, the treatment or the teaching of parents and the coaching happens over a period of about 12 weeks. And then hopefully parents will be able to continue using these after the teaching that we do of them stops. And so there are a number of kind of common elements to whether, regardless of whether we're talking about trying to help parents who have young children or parents who have teenagers. And one of the things that we teach them to do is to use what we call follow and commenting, which really means talking about what the child is attending to at that moment in time. And part of the reason that's important is if you hear talk right at the moment that you're really interested in the world in front of you, that's really going to be helpful for learning. If there are new things that you don't know the words for and you're looking at them and you're interested in them and you hear language that might map onto that, that's kind of a nice setting for learning language. We also want to prompt communication indirectly. And there are a number of ways to do that. And just one way to think about that is if you're a child and imagine that all of your toys that you own are all on the floor before you. Well, you don't really need to ask for anything. You don't need to communicate. You can just get them yourself. But if some of the toys are maybe up on a shelf and you can see them, but you can't reach them, now you have to communicate. Now you have to ask for help. So that's an opportunity for your parent or other caregiver to give you language, right? And show you how to ask for those things. So rather than just looking toward them, they can say, "Do you want the doll? Do you want the train?" And you're giving them the words again where they're interested and they really need to communicate, or they need to say train or more or whatever, right? And then the third kind of strategy we teach is to respond contingently, which just really means taking what the child has said and then turning it into something more mature from a communication perspective. So if the child points towards something, you could say, "You want the milk, you want more milk." And so you're giving them the words that match their communication intent. Or if they say, "Doggy," and they point to a dog, you can say, "Yes, that's a really big doggy and he's barking," right? So you can give them more words to go and give them kind of a more sophisticated way of talking about what they're interested in communicating. And so we've done this with a couple of different populations of kids with Fragile X syndrome and their families. And this was with preschoolers with uh, um, really limited language. Some of the preschoolers with Fragile X syndrome had no words, some had a few words, some had some combinations. And so we really were interested in whether or not at the end of this intervention, after teaching parents how to use these strategies, how did the kids do? And what we found was that you can see from baseline when we started to the end of intervention that the children were much more likely to respond with communicative attempts, whether those were words or gestures or looks, when parents prompted them, but they also did more of that spontaneously. So they were much more able to communicate their intents, whether prompted or unprompted, as a result of the intervention. We also did this with more with older individuals with Fragile X syndrome. These were adolescents with Fragile X syndrome, and they all had some language, but with language limitations as well. And so we taught their parents how to use these strategies rather than the context of play, as we did in the preschool study. We taught them within the context of going through and talking about books that didn't have any words. So they had to kind of tell the stories together of these books without words. So it wasn't about reading, it was really about using the books as kind of the topic of conversation. And what I've graphed here is there is a measure of the breadth of their vocabulary at the beginning of the intervention and then after the intervention. And the blue represents a group that didn't get any treatment. We just kind of followed them. And the orange are those who got the parent implemented language intervention. And you can see the higher bars for the orange, indicating that their vocabulary improved over the pretty dramatically over the course of this 12-week intervention. So again, these are strategies that parents can use to essentially become their child's speech language clinician, if you will. Now, I think ideally we also want to have speech language clinicians working directly with individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions, but parents also have a lot of power to support their children's language and communication. And so I just want to make some acknowledgments. We've been really fortunate, Angie and I, to have a lot of funding for our research over the last few decades, mainly from the National Institutes of Health, but also from some private foundations. And we've had a lot of great colleagues working with us. And obviously, there have been hundreds and hundreds of families who have been so generous with their time and really enthusiastic and participating in our research. And so we really thank them and we thank you for supporting our research. And then I think I just want to say thank you to all of you And then Angie, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Well,
Just
I also put our contact info
oh,
and
perfect,
Vivian's contact info,
good,
who is our coordinator,
right.
just in case anyone.
Right. If you ever have questions about our studies or just have questions and need resources, we're happy to help. If we don't know an answer, we usually know somebody who does know an answer, and we're happy to find resources for you. And so there are those. And then Angie's going to talk about this new study that she is leading, which is a really, I think, one of the most important studies we've done in our lab in a very long time, and we're really excited about starting this. So I'll let her talk about that, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, so really briefly, as I mentioned, when we really try to listen and take feedback from our families as they're telling us what their worries and concerns are. And as I mentioned, we don't know enough about the different paths children take. And so for the next project we did, we're really focusing on unpacking what children are doing when early on in development. So we're going to be seeing families across 5 sites. And we're going to do a couple of in-person visits, but what we're really going to do is check-ins via telehealth every few months to find out what's new, what's going on, what we're doing. And we are really hoping to turn this information into a developmental kind of what to expect specifically for children with Down syndrome. And so that we hope will give us a much better understanding of the timing and what to expect, which is something we think will really support providers and families planning as well as improving our intervention. So that is one of our newest projects that we're right about to launch. So yeah, I'll stop sharing. And if there are any questions or anything, we're happy to discuss.
Yeah, if you have any questions, and I believe there's a question in our,
Oh, what about Down syndrome regression disorder? Is there any interventions to help restore their speech and language?
So I'll say that I don't know a lot about the treatments that are available. There's certainly some medications that I think have been begun to be studied in clinical trials. And just anecdotally, we have had interactions with some families in our studies whose young people have had Down syndrome regressive disorder, but then made improvements after treatments. And so I think it's still in the early stages of understanding why this happens, how it's related to or not related to later Alzheimer's disease. And again, just beginning to try some treatments. But the right now, the little bit of data there is suggests that there is a way to improve outcomes, even for kids who have lost a lot of skills.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure. Any other questions?
the slides that you showed, I think it went up to 25. You don't have any data for older ones? My son is almost 27, you know.
Yeah.
Well, so we have, thank you for mentioning that. We have a study ongoing now with colleagues at the University of Alabama, and we have tried to go older to begin to see, are we seeing more decline later on? And eventually we would like to continue to follow a lot of the cohort of folks who have participated to see how they continue to do. And so, yeah, in the current study, I think we go up to, is it late 20s? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we'll know more. We are still kind of following up with some families. And so hopefully within the next year, we'll have more data on other areas of decline. And I think the real important thing, too, is that, we had a lot of measures in that study that I showed you those slides. And some we did see plateaus where there weren't continuing to be improvements in some areas of language skill and cognitive skill in the 20s. But then there were some, like receptive vocabulary, we're continuing to see growth. And then there were those where we're seeing kind of complicated pictures of decline. So I think this is a really important period of development, and there's a real need to continue to follow these folks so we can learn more about this transition before they have Alzheimer's disease. I think, what can we do to kind of optimize development, continue to improve language and communication skills, and maybe kind of forestall some of the declines we see in Alzheimer's disease if we can get some good interventions going. And certainly there's a lot of excitement about medications for people with Down syndrome who are beginning to show declines. But there's also a lot of evidence for lifestyle interventions. In fact, if you look at research on Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline in the general population, lifestyle matters a lot. And so nutrition, exercise, having social interactions, having a job so that you continue to have cognitive challenges, and then taking care of hearing loss. So getting a hearing aid is actually one of the best things you can do, regardless of whether you have a Down syndrome or you're in the kind of your neurotypical, to make sure that you continue to have healthy brain aging.
Hmm. And Sandra, I'm glad you brought that up because I think historically, what has kind of happened is we do have in the field a lot of work being dedicated to like later adulthood and concerns around Alzheimer's. And then we have had a lot of attention to this transition age because there's so many things that families were asking us about. What happens as these services, fall away and there's so much to unpack. And so Len talked about um, do some of the developmental changes we see reflect early aging related concerns, but I think we have a lot of attention to how much is this about the sort of sudden and abrupt environmental and developmental changes. There's a lot to unpack in that period, but kind of what happened is we ended up on two sides, and I think both research groups, our adult aging group and our development groups, are kind of working to fill in as quickly as we can that in between period because there's so much about just growth and development to focus on, and not just Alzheimer's related changing, but across the board, we have a big gap in adulthood that we are very, very much interested in trying to fill. So we have some plans, as you mentioned. We're kind of finishing up in our late 20s right now and like
Mhm.
hoping to jump
With
and
the older one.
continue. Mm-hmm.
And yeah,
Yeah,
and I'm hearing more like medical related issues also. Once people go past their late 30s and just new things that we're finding out. So it's a lot of new stuff, I think.
I
It
think
is.
one of the
But
other things that we're seeing too, and I think there's research to support this, is that, as Angie mentioned, as kids transition out of school and kind of transition work programs, um, that's a lot of change for families and it's a lot of change for them. And we do see a fair number of people who have mental health challenges. Maybe as a result of that, we don't really know fully. And so depression is really common, and that will impact, your ability to learn new things and your ability to stay active and all of those sorts of things. And so I think it's really important that families, if they have concerns about, their 21-year-olds seems depressed, to make sure that they can find someone who understands that and can treat mental health challenges in people with disabilities. And that's a hard ask because a lot of people will just say, well, it's somebody with Down syndrome, so there's really nothing else to treat. But not everyone ends up depressed, but there are some young people that can get depression, and I think that they need to have that treated the same way if they were neurotypical, or. So I think there are a lot of things going on in that early 20s into the 30s, that are really important to address, regardless of whether it has to do with Alzheimer's disease or not.
when you have babies or young kids, and you kind of, you're set with your medical providers, and it feels like, when you start with your baby and people around you met, the medical field, it feels like you come and train people, and then you do all this stuff, and then for years you're good. But after your child turns 19, 21, and they have to go to the new doctors, and then it feels like you start all over again. So
Yeah.
even if you have concerns about regression or whatever it is, it's hard to get those things I guess addressed, you know.
Yeah.
Absolutely true. I think um, there's so many things that are kind of popping up in this space as like hot topics that we're trying, along with so many people in the field, to figure out how to supplement. So, as we were talking about the transition age, we've seen an expansion in programs for individuals with disabilities to participate more. Um, Genuinely and completely at college programs at various levels of support. We have also seen a ton of focus on trying to figure out how to improve provider training. And this comes from a few different spaces, right? Is that we definitely need to improve provider training for neurodevelopmental conditions. We also have this interaction that we have seen a tremendous amount of improvement in medical attention for individuals with Down syndrome that has kind of led to the success in improving lifespan. That also means our providers were trained by people who did not generally see individuals in this age groups, you
Mhm.
know, as part of their kind of historical training. And so there's a lot of stuff going on across groups and thinking about how can we improve that. We have a transition clinic for trying to launch, but there's a lot of like, how can we kind of disseminate information and help people? So, like, the stuff we're doing with the little kids is really focused on trying to get to as quickly as possible a way to improve providers and families conversations about that. There's a lot of work by like Global Down Syndrome Foundation and things for medical management and things like that.
Mhm.
So absolutely true that there's huge needs in so many areas, um, that we're kind of just filling as
It's
quickly
a
as we.
lot. It's a lot.
No, it is, but I also think it's so important to have these conversations because I know for us, we go to the next big thing that it feels like our families are telling us to go to, right? So with the little kids, this was what the conversation was about. And so this is where we went next. We are like, I feel like we can figure out how to do this. Let's go do this. The transition age was our last big conversations with families where it just felt like over and over again. So I think it's so important to have these conversations and have such a direct relationship with relationships and research and sort of guiding to make sure that the questions researchers are trying to address are most meaningful and important to families. But there are a lot of things to do better on across the board. But it's things like this that help us be like, oh, right, this is coming up
Mhm.
too much. Let's go there
Yeah,
next.
and I want to just mention two things that I know we're out of time, but at the minus, Angie mentioned our transition clinic, and that was one that really started because families were identifying this as a need. And it's a clinic that is less focused on medical issues, although it does help families identify providers who are going to be knowledgeable about Down syndrome or intellectual and developmental disabilities in general as people age out of the pediatric healthcare system. But it also does things like what are the education opportunities? What are the employment opportunities? Well, how do you get resources from the government to support your son and daughter now that they're out of school? And so it's a really great clinic. And the other thing I just wanted to mention, and I think this is particularly relevant here, is so we started in about 5 years ago, we started UC Davis Redwood Seed Scholars Program, which is a post-secondary college experience for people with intellectual disabilities. They live on campus, they take UC Davis classes, get internships and get employment. And our first cohort graduated, and 88% of these, there's 8 people graduated in our first cohort, all had intellectual disabilities. Several had Down syndrome. 88% of them graduated with a job, and the
Oh.
job is competitive integrated employment. So they're earning a living wage and they're working with support or without support in meaningful employment. And also 88% are actually now living independently. Some are rooming together. And so So the moral of the story there is, if you give people an opportunity to learn, whether they have an intellectual disability or not, they learn and they can grow into jobs and they can have better lives and they can have employment, which is absolutely critical. And so I think people are attending more and more to adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities because it has been such an unmet needs. It's all fallen on families to figure it out when their kids get out of school, and it's hard to figure out, and it's hard to generate opportunities. So we're working really hard, and all of this comes from families telling us what their needs are. So that's why we love doing these talks, even on a Saturday morning. We
Yeah,
love
yeah.
families, and we
Uh,
appreciate the
one
invitation.
one last question.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry.
No, no, no.
Everybody else has questions, but I do. Uh, I hear a lot of families, even around my son's age, they're looking for speech therapist providers, and myself included. So I know my son is on a couple of waiting lists and stuff, but most places don't take adults with with Downs or disabilities. I guess
Mhm.
most of them don't. Because I did my own, I guess research and called several places. But in the program that you're talking about for the young ones, is there like an opportunity for older parents to, or are you guys gonna create anything like that?
Yeah, well, we don't have any studies right now doing that, but I think what we are happy to do is we can share information about our parent implemented language interventions. I mean, most of the things that we teach parents are not particularly sophisticated. They just require some practice, and they require kind of recognizing the barriers to using these strategies. And I think they work for anyone. The other thing I'll say is that I really think it's unfortunate. I think even in high school, I think people with intellectual disabilities, including those with Down syndrome, are getting less speech and language services than they need. And I think it's partly based on this assumption that, in fact, they have a plateau and can't learn new things, which I think is really misguided and not supported by the evidence. But I think the therapy would be different in lots of places where you could embed language therapy in kind of job training as well, because if you're going to have a job, you have to interact with other people, so that's an opportunity. So I think there are lots of opportunities for improving language. I think we just need to get more. We need more speech language clinicians, and we need more people to recognize that this is important to do throughout the life course, not just until the kids are in high school. And so I think it's a serious problem, and I think it's really um, uh, uh, it's a disservice to the community that we don't do better at providing services across the lifespan.
And I think one of the things Len and I have been thinking a lot about is that the old ways we've done things are just not working in terms of getting access out to the communities. And we're really lucky that our current director at the Mind Institute is really big on like, how do we move the ideas we have internally to something that's going to actually work and stick in the real world. And I know those active conversations have really changed the way I've thought about things. And so I think we're doing a lot more of thinking about how to move these to more accessible, like how do we move so with the little kid study, right? We have to do this really big intense study, but the goal is to turn it into something public that then can take off and be used
Right.
and guide, a different way of thinking about this. I think we're starting to think of, as we do it in this space, how can we do that with our language strategies for supporting communication? How can we turn these things into platforms that are more shareable, so it's less guarded by access to a provider, access to a resource? Because the most common conversation I'm ending up with currently is that you're telling me about all these great things, but like I can't get to you, or my healthcare system doesn't have a developmental behavioral pediatrician, or I don't have an adult provider who does that. And so I think the way I was trained is those people were the people who disseminated this information. And now
Mhm.
that's not a model that's sustainable. And so I think we are trying to re-envision how can we get research to push these things to methods in schools, methods in the home, methods of information transfer that are much more disseminable. And I think one of the nice things about the massive technology change we've seen is there's a lot more room for that, right? Like 10 years ago, it was
Oh yeah.
like hard to envision how to do these things, but I think we are under a lot of pressure and a lot of positive tools that can really help us move these things in a different way. So it is definitely on our vision of how can we be part of the forces that help disseminate this stuff and translate it. Um, and we are struggling with there's only so many of us currently that are doing this work. And so how can we leverage across conditions, across all the people we know who are doing great work to move these things to work for as many families as possible so it's not just guarded to one group or a space.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I think we're past our time, so I know people want to go too. But thank you. I really appreciate you spent your morning here with us, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Everyone else, so please, thank
Well,
you for
thank you for the
joining us this
invitation. If
morning.
Yeah,
people
thank
have
you.
email us, we're happy to respond. So just let us know. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much. Oh, one last thing, can
Yeah.
I ask?
Sure.
It would be interesting to see the study that you showed us with the lines, maybe different color lines, so you can follow and see which individual was dropping out or going up
Oh, yeah.
like that.
Good point.
I would,
Yeah.
anyway, thank you so much and have
Thank
a
you.
wonderful weekend then. Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank
Thank you,
Thank you.
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Jeffrey.